The room had been sealed for 2 decades, yet stepping inside felt like entering a moment that had never moved forward. The air held a faint trace of paper and rain-soaked dirt, the kind that settles into floorboards and refuses to leave. Dust clung to every surface as if time itself had gathered and stayed. This was where it began in 1999, an old rental cabin outside a quiet North Carolina town, a place locals still mentioned in careful tones. The scene was undisturbed, archived, forgotten, waiting. Her name had been Liora Mayfield, 27, a graphic designer with a habit of photographing ordinary objects as if they held secrets. Her friends had described her as observant, private, always looking past what was shown. She had been found lying near the back window, her camera on the floor, its lens pointed upward like an open eye. No struggle marks, no belongings taken, no easy explanation. A single event with a stillness that unsettled the investigators even then. The lead investigator at the time, now older, quieter, slower, returned to the site 20 years later. He stepped inside with measured breaths, treating the lingering evidence like the shadows of a decision he had once made too quickly. His name was Daniel Rourke, and the silence of this room had followed him through every case after, threading itself into his thoughts like a reminder. He ran his fingers along the table where the first file had once been arranged. Paper rustled faintly as he placed his new notebook beside the old case folder. A pause. A breath. Then the soft click of a pen. The atmosphere carried a faint echo of the past, a broken curtain rod, a single overturned chair, the faint scent of dried pine from the walls. He imagined the original team moving quietly through the cabin, their footsteps careful, their voices low. Back then, he had stood near the threshold, unsure, trying to hold his reactions inside. Even now, he remembered the weight of the unanswered question. Why here? Why her? A photograph from the original file lay at the top. Liora's camera had captured a final frame before the device slipped from her hand. It showed the edge of the window, streaked with the reflection of lights from a car outside. The frame was blurry, almost accidental, yet it remained the only known clue. Investigators had dismissed it as irrelevant at the time, just a fragment of a moment already fading. Rourke stared at it again, letting his eyes adjust to its grainy texture. Something about the angle still felt slightly off, as if she had turned sharply just before dropping the camera. As if she had seen something familiar enough not to alarm her immediately, yet strange enough to make her cautious. The room seemed to close in around him. He whispered, "Miss Mayfield." A hesitant line, nothing more. The case had never been solved. Not then. Not for 20 years. But today, standing in that suspended moment, Rourke felt the faint stir of movement, a small shift in the silence. The story was waking up again. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It began with an item that should not have existed. A sealed envelope, left anonymously at the county office 2 weeks earlier. Inside was a single photograph, one that the original inventory never listed. Not an old print not worn by time, but a crisp, recent reproduction of a picture clearly taken on the night Liora died. It showed the same window, the same faint streak of reflected light, but with one subtle difference. A figure partially visible near the edge, barely more than a silhouette. The envelope contained no message, no markings. Just the image. The discovery reached Rourke through routine mail review. At first sight, he felt a calm shift of awareness, the kind that made seasoned investigators pause. He placed the photo under a lamp, its edges catching the warm glow. The figure was indistinct, but the posture suggested someone standing outside, angled toward the window, not approaching, watching. The photo's clarity suggested it came from the original camera's internal memory card, one long believed to be missing. In 1999, teams had searched the cabin several times, yet the card never surfaced. Without it, the timeline remained fractured. The envelope implied that someone still held it, or had held it long enough to extract a single key frame. Rourke moved through the reopened storage room, pulling out boxes that hadn't been touched since the early 2000s. He set them on a metal cart, his movements calm but precise. The sound of cardboard shifting echoed lightly, stirring old dust into the air. The file labels, faded handwriting, smudged ink, felt like quiet reminders of a stalled pursuit. A technician joined him briefly, saying only, "This came in last night." Another envelope smaller. Inside was a memory card. Old, scratched but intact. Rourke lifted it with gloved fingers, his expression unreadable. The weight of the object felt heavier than its size suggested. This was the missing piece that had shaped 20 years of uncertainty. Someone had kept it hidden long enough to outweigh attention, then returned it without explanation. He inserted it into an isolated reader. A progress bar climbed slowly, the room filled with the soft hum of the system. Then folders appeared. Only one file remained accessible, a single image. The rest had been erased, overwritten, or damaged beyond retrieval. The surviving image matched the photograph mailed earlier. Same window, same light streak, same blurred figure. But this time, zooming in revealed a second detail. The faint outline of a hand raised near the window frame, as if the person had been touching it lightly. The gesture seemed calm, deliberate. Rourke leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. A quiet breath, the sort that allowed thoughts to settle into place. He wrote a simple line in his notebook. "Someone returned to the scene before we did." He turned the image again, studying the posture. It didn't match any known suspect from the original inquiry, yet the presence felt familiar in a subtle way, the stance of someone who knew the cabin's layout. He closed the folder gently. The past, once immobile, had shifted forward. The case was no longer dormant. It had reopened itself. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. Rourke carried the old file boxes into a dim corner of the evidence review room. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, giving everything a muted, washed-out tone. He arranged the files in chronological order, each folder marked with dates from the original timeline. As he opened the first binder, the pages released a soft scent of aging paper, warm, dusty, weighted with memories. He began reading. The earliest reports were clinical and cautious. Officer logs described entering the cabin at dawn, the sun barely crossing the tree line. They noted the position of Liora's body, the items scattered around, the absence of forced entry. Yet one entry caught his attention. A deputy had mentioned a faint footprint near the back steps, partially smudged by rain. It had been considered too incomplete for comparison and was filed away. Rourke marked the page with a thin blue tab. He turned to the photographs. The cabin's interior appeared much the same as today. Wood paneling, narrow hallways, the same window with the view of the gravel drive. But in an early forensic shot, he noticed something that the original investigators had not highlighted. A small metal hook near the window frame, loosely attached, as if recently disturbed. He studied it closely. The hook's angle pointed slightly outward, not downward. A detail easy to overlook. He continued to the witness statements. Liora's colleagues had described her last few weeks as quiet but focused. She had been working on a personal photo series, Objects in Transition, she had said. Her close friend, a librarian named Mara, had reported that Liora often visited the cabin to concentrate, using the solitude as a place to think without interruption. Mara had mentioned seeing a particular person around Liora during that time, someone who seemed helpful but distant. The name was barely legible in the aged ink, but the reference remained. Rourke whispered it aloud, almost unintentionally. Yevon. A simple, hesitant syllable. He continued reading. The old interviews with Evan listed him as a friend, someone who had dropped by the cabin twice that month. His alibi had been acceptable at the time. He claimed to be visiting family on the night of the incident. With no contradictory evidence, the lead team had moved on. Rourke flipped to the discarded notes. These were the pages investigators had set aside, scribbles, half-thoughts, observations written during long hours. One page held a sketch of the window frame with a small mark indicating something reflective seen near the glass. Another note referenced a visitor log from the prior week, though the log itself was missing from the archive. These gaps formed patterns, small ones but consistent. He returned to the new photograph, the one sent anonymously. The figure outside the window stood exactly where the disturbance on the metal hook would align, and the posture, the slight tilt of the shoulder, matched the description in an old report where someone mentioned Evan had a habit of leaning slightly when standing still, as if balancing a weight. Rourke placed the documents side by side. He allowed silence to settle, letting connections form naturally. No sudden revelation. Only slow alignment. A quiet, steady pull toward clarity. He made a final note at the bottom of the page. The simplest detail is often the one ignored. The room felt colder now. Not ominous, just aware. This was the beginning. The past was returning in fragments, and he would follow them all. The list formed slowly, built from old notes, new questions, and a silence that hovered over every name. Rourke laid them out on the table, 4 individuals whose connections to Liora were subtle, quiet, threaded through daily life in 1999. None had been charged. All had moved on in different ways, yet each held a small piece of the story. The first, Evan Hale, the friend whose name had reappeared in the recently unearthed notes. Once a quiet presence in Liora's life, he had been known for helping with her photography equipment, sometimes driving her to remote spots for shoots. His alibi, visiting family, had been supported by a relative's statement, though no physical evidence ever confirmed it. He had since relocated to Maryland, working in logistics, a profession built on schedules and orderly routes. His involvement had once seemed unlikely, yet the returned photograph placed someone of his posture near the window. That detail rested uneasily in Rourke's mind. The second suspect came from a more distant connection, Tessa Warren, Liora's former roommate from her college years. They had shared an apartment before their paths quietly diverged. Tessa had mentioned friction over creative partnerships, a planned project that dissolved when Liora withdrew unexpectedly. Old statements from friends hinted at resentment, though Tessa had maintained she hadn't seen Liora for months before the incident. Her alibi placed her in Raleigh the night of the death, working a late shift at a cafe. The logbook confirmed her clock in time but not the hours after midnight. Whether that mattered remained uncertain. Third on the list was Mark Deaton, the cabin's owner. He rented the place seasonally and claimed to barely know Liora. Yet he was the one who found her body during a routine check, a detail that had placed him temporarily under scrutiny. He had seemed cooperative at the time, but held a nervous air in the early reports. He'd mentioned a broken latch on the back door, though investigators couldn't determine whether it happened before or after the incident. His alibi, spending the evening repairing equipment in his workshop, was difficult to disprove but equally hard to verify. The final name surfaced from an unfiled statement, Joan Mercer, a neighbor living near the gravel road leading to the cabin. She had reported seeing a parked vehicle around the time Liora was believed to have arrived that evening. She described it vaguely: dark color, older model, headlights dim. Her own whereabouts were never a concern. She had been at a community event that evening. But one part of her statement stood out. She recalled seeing someone walking near the cabin earlier that week, someone who seemed familiar enough to dismiss at the time. She hadn't recognized the person's face, only the posture, upright, steady, careful. Rourke spread their files across the table. He stood in silence, letting the arrangement speak. Each suspect carried motives of varying weight: resentment, opportunity, familiarity, proximity. None were strong enough alone, yet none could be dismissed. The cold case had once struggled under the simplicity of the scene. No struggle, no theft, no message. But the new evidence introduced an unfamiliar tension, suggesting someone had approached with a calm deliberation, not panic. He studied the old interview transcripts again. Small fragments surfaced. From Evan: "She liked the quiet there. Didn't always tell people when she was going." From Tessa: "We weren't close anymore. She canceled last minute sometimes, made things hard." From Mark: "Never saw anything unusual. The place was locked when I arrived." From Joan: "Can't remember the face, but the way they stood felt familiar. The voices felt distant, half-present, shaped by time." Rourke imagined himself back in 1999, young, careful, uncertain. He recalled the feeling of urgency then, the pressure to produce answers quickly. Perhaps that rush had allowed smaller truths to slip by. He pulled the new image closer. The silhouette was angled slightly, shoulder turned, weight shifted, enough to suggest the person had been waiting, not moving. He wrote a line across his notes: "Presence before action." He circled each suspect's name once, then underlined only one: the person whose posture had been mentioned twice over 20 years apart. Not proof, just a direction. Outside, the corridor hummed quietly as evening settled. Inside, the evidence felt heavier, as if the room itself recognized that the story was narrowing. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next morning, Rourke returned to the board with a thermos of plain coffee and a quiet determination. The lights hummed faintly, casting a muted glow across the wall of documents. He moved through the evidence with slow, steady attention, reading, pausing, reading again. The inconsistencies were small, subtle, almost intentional in their simplicity. He began with the timeline. According to early reports, Liora had arrived at the cabin shortly before dusk. She had brought her camera bag, a notebook, and 2 envelopes containing her latest prints. The caretaker had seen her car parked neatly by the front steps. Everything suggested she planned a routine evening of work. Yet in her notebook, recovered from the cabin, he found a single strange line dated the day before. Someone visited, didn't knock. No name. No description. Just the sentence. The original team had dismissed it as unrelated. Perhaps she meant a delivery, a neighbor, or even a stray visitor. But alongside the newly surfaced photograph, the sentence carried new weight. A second clue emerged in the maintenance report from the cabin owner, Mark. He noted repairing the back door latch earlier that month. His handwriting on the form had an added comment: loose again, strange. The back door showed no sign of forced entry, but the disturbance on the small metal hook near the window matched the location where someone could have quietly reached in without leaving clear marks. Rourke connected the notes with a thin blue string. Next, he examined Tessa's statements. She had downplayed the tension between her and Liora, but one of Leora's coworkers had mentioned overhearing a conversation weeks earlier, soft, concerned, ending abruptly. The coworker wrote that Liora seemed careful around certain people, though she didn't specify who. The coworker had added in the margin, Evan visited the office once, stood oddly close to her desk. In old photographs from the workspace, Rourke noticed a small item pinned above Leora's computer, a photo of the cabin from a distance, taken in late afternoon light. Someone had written a note on the back, "Quiet place, good thinking spot." The writing wasn't hers. Small threaded connections formed. A visitor who didn't knock. A door latch frequently disturbed. A figure with familiar posture. Tension she never explained. Someone who knew her routines, but felt distant enough to remain unnoticed. The emotional conflicts revealed themselves not in words, but in absence. Liora had been private, yet open to certain people. Her comfort zone had narrow boundaries. Someone had stepped quietly inside them. Another detail surfaced from Joan's neighbor's statement. She recalled seeing Liora once on the gravel road, speaking to someone near a parked car. She couldn't hear the words but remembered Leora's expression, calm but with a subdued caution. Joan described the exchange as civil but weighted. Rourke pinned this line near the center of the board. A pattern formed not from evidence alone but from its mood, intentional quietness, careful distance, familiar presence. Whoever had approached the cabin that night had done so with deliberation. No rush, no panic. The returned photograph, the missing memory card, the careful timing of the envelope, all these actions belonged to someone who understood patience. Rourke paused, closing his eyes briefly. He listened to the sound of paper shifting as the air conditioner hummed. A slow inhale. A quiet exhale. He turned back to the board. Every clue pointed toward emotional restraint, not impulsive harm. Someone who felt something unresolved, neither anger nor rage, but a controlled intensity shaped by time. And with that, suspects began to reorder themselves, not by motive alone but by emotional landscape. He placed one name at the center, not as an accusation, as a gravitational pull. The silence felt heavier now, as if the room itself understood what was forming. 6. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. It came not from a confession, nor an overlooked object, but from a logical inconsistency that refused to disappear. Late evening, Rourke sat reviewing the visitor timeline again. The logs from the cabin owner's records mentioned routine checks performed weekly. Nothing unusual the week prior to the incident, except one detail barely visible in the faded ink. A signature beside a maintenance note. Secure window hooks. The signature was not Mark's. It belonged to Joan Mercer, the neighbor who claimed minimal involvement. Her reason for signing was unclear. Her statement never mentioned entering the property or inspecting anything. She had only spoken of seeing a parked vehicle. The original investigators hadn't questioned the signature. It looked like a routine delivery acceptance or acknowledgement of a visit. Rourke pulled her file again. Joan had lived near the gravel road for decades. She had been the first to report seeing an unfamiliar vehicle. She had been the one who called in when the cabin's light remained on unusually late that week. But something in her statements carried a quiet, calm familiarity, an ease when discussing the cabin itself. She knew the windows, the latch, the road angles. Her recollections were too precise for someone claiming limited awareness. He compared her handwriting with the note on the back of the photo pinned above Leora's old workspace. The curves, the downward slant, the spacing, they matched. The realization unfolded gently, with no sense of shock. Just clarity. Joan had known Liora, not socially, not as a neighbor, but in a different way. She had once worked at a small print shop in town, one Liora frequently used. Their interactions had gone unmentioned in the reports. No one had considered her significant. She had been treated as a helpful witness, nothing more. Rourke searched deeper. In an archived address record, he found that Joan owned an older model car, a dark sedan, the same type she described seeing near the cabin. Her statement had distanced herself from the event by describing her own vehicle as if it belonged to someone else. He shaped the timeline. Joan visited the cabin earlier that week, under the pretense of securing window hooks. She interacted with Liora at the print shop and knew her routines. She had a reason to be near the gravel road the evening Liora arrived. The figure in the photograph showed careful posture, not tension. The memory card was returned anonymously, suggesting a lingering conscience. The signature, unnoticed for 20 years, connected her directly to the scene. The twist was not dramatic. It was quiet, methodical. She had never been a prime suspect. She had been a helper, a neighbor, a witness, and therefore overlooked. Rourke leaned back, letting the pieces settle into place. No anger, no shock, only understanding. He whispered the line he had written earlier. The simplest detail is often the one ignored. And the story shifted, revealing its quiet truth. The morning after the full timeline crystallized, Rourke returned once more to the cabin. The land was quiet, still holding the early winter chill, and the gravel shifted beneath his boots in a slow, muted crunch. Nothing about the place had changed, not the thin mist hovering over the trees nor the faint scent of pine. It stood exactly as it had for 2 decades, a setting preserved by neglect and distance. He stepped inside, letting the door fall shut with a soft click. Light from the narrow windows settled across the floor in pale strips, catching dust that floated like small drifting particles of memory. He held the reopened case file under one arm and the anonymous envelope in his hand. The air felt almost the same as it had the first time he entered in 1999, disconnected, quiet, heavy. But Rourke himself was different now. Age had pressed questions into him, softened his certainty, sharpened his awareness of what people carried silently. The evidence proved the sequence. The logic revealed the truth. Yet the truth did not arrive with any sense of triumph. It came with restraint, measured and calm, just like the person who had left the photograph behind. He placed the envelope on the old table beside the worn circle where a lamp had once been. He sat slowly, letting the chair creak beneath him. He opened the file and spread out the pages. The witness statements, maintenance logs, old photos, the list of suspects, and finally the note Liora wrote in her notebook, someone visited. Didn't knock. That small line settled deeper into meaning now. It was not fear. It wasn't even warning. It was observation, Liora recognizing a presence she didn't consider a threat. Joan Mercer had lived a quiet life nearby, one shaped by routine and a desire for calm. Her interactions with Liora at the print shop created a subtle, unspoken familiarity, one that hadn't seemed important at the time. But something in that familiarity had changed. Perhaps a misunderstanding. Perhaps an expectation that never formed into words. Perhaps a quiet attachment that Liora had not seen clearly. The truth was never loud. It never arrived with force. It had moved gently, unnoticed for 20 years. Rourke reviewed the timeline again. Joan visiting the cabin earlier that week, signing the maintenance note. Joan's car matching the one she claimed to have seen. The figure in the returned photo showing posture that fit her height and stance. The anonymous envelope arriving at the county office, suggesting private regret rather than concealment. The memory card returned intact, one file untouched. The logic was complete. The case technically was solved. Yet the resolution left no victory in its wake, only a muted understanding of quiet choices and unintended consequences. He imagined the moment Liora saw Joan through the window. Perhaps she recognized her and stepped closer, not with fear but with curiosity. The lack of struggle, the stillness of the room, the composed position of her belongings. They suggested an encounter that shifted too quickly, a fragile moment that broke under the weight of misinterpretation. Rourke traced a faint line on the table with his gloved fingertip. His breath met the cold air in small clouds. He remained silent, letting the shape of the truth settle around him. A soft memory surfaced, his younger self standing in this same room, unsure why the scene felt incomplete. Back then, he had chalked it up to lack of experience, but he realized now that the incomplete feeling had come from the scene's emotional quietness. Nothing dramatic, nothing chaotic, just a moment where something subtle had gone wrong. And those kinds of moments were the hardest to see. He stood slowly, gathering the documents. He closed the envelope, sealing it again out of habit, as though it were still waiting to be processed. He placed the file in his bag and gave the room one final look. Outside, the trees shifted in a slight breeze, branches brushing against each other with a faint wooden whisper. The gravel road stretched ahead, unchanged, a thin path through a landscape that had watched countless seasons pass without concern. Rourke walked toward his car. Each step was deliberate, steady. He placed the file in the passenger seat, letting it rest on the upholstery as if it were another quiet presence. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he looked back at the cabin through the windshield. It sat motionless, a small wooden box holding the weight of 2 decades of silence. A place that had outlasted confusion, suspicion, and countless theories. The truth had been here all along, but buried beneath a layer of normalcy, familiarity, and the kind of stillness people rarely question. He thought of Liora's last photograph. The blurred frame, the faint light, the silhouette that hinted at someone she knew. He thought of Joan's calm voice describing the vehicle on the road. He thought of the envelope arriving without explanation, as if someone had finally decided that silence had lingered too long. Justice in its mechanical form would move forward now. Reports would be filed, interviews conducted, statements cross-checked. The procedural wheels would turn, slow but steady. But justice, true justice, held no comfort here. Rourke placed his hand on the steering wheel, letting the leather warm slowly under his palm. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than he remembered, lines deeper, eyes quieter. He exhaled and finally turned the key. As the engine hummed to life, he whispered into the empty car, not out of habit, but out of something softer. Truth isn't always visible. The words hung in the air, neither heavy nor relieving. Just honest. He eased the car down the gravel road. The cabin shrank in the distance, framed by tall pines and lingering morning mist. Soon it would disappear behind a bend, hidden once more from passing eyes. The case was closed. The story was not triumphant. And justice, though technically delivered, felt more like a mechanism than a victory. Some truths remain quiet even when revealed. Some answers return gently instead of loudly. And some cases end not with resolution, but with the recognition that people carry unseen corners of themselves, places no report can fully document. As the road straightened and the morning light grew clearer, Rourke felt the final weight of the case settle into memory. Not heavy, not light, simply present. And the truth, quiet, restrained, uncovered through patience rather than force, remained as it had always been. Not far beneath the surface, just beyond immediate sight, waiting for someone willing to look carefully enough.